Humans first domesticated horses in around about 3500 BCE. Since then, they've pulled our chariots and our carts, they've carried royalty and soldiers, they've worked on farms, and they've been steadfast companions. Now, horses are actually a prey animal, which perhaps explains their vulnerability to supernatural attack by witches and fairies. Yet, as the stories in this episode will show, they're also famous for their speed, ability to help humans, and even fantastical leaps and bounds. So let's have a look at these various horses from spectres to Black Bess in this episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with our theme of the folklore of mammals, and this time we're having a look at horses. Now, obviously, horses is an absolutely humongous topic. And I was looking at them going, do you know what, there's actually almost too much to cover. So we're not going to be looking at the Kelpie or the Uska in this episode. Obviously, I've done the Kelpie before in a separate one. And our focus is going to be on horses, either spectral or real, rather than horse-like creatures. We're going to keep horses and their links to mythology for a separate episode, so we won't have any Pegasus either. And obviously the unicorn is missing because I've got a whole separate episode on unicorns as well, even though I'm convinced unicorns are actually rhinos. I'm also not looking at the Mariloid or any other hobby horse traditions because there are several, because I do really think that they actually deserve an episode on their own because there's just that much to say about them. So we're going to be having a look at different types of horse-related stories and how they appear in folklore specifically. Most of this is pretty much English folklore, but I have a pretty good feeling that a lot of these things will also appear in folklore near you, wherever it is that you happen to be, because horses are pretty ubiquitous as a human companion. But we're going to start off with spectral horses, because there's a legend at Marbury Hall in Cheshire of a ghost of a lady riding a white horse. And seen at sunset, people think that she's Lady Barrymore. And obviously I've talked a lot about white lady ghosts, but to have a lady riding a white horse ghost seemed a little bit more interesting. Now, according to legend, the horse is a mare named the Marbury Dun. This mare was reputedly so swift that Lord Barrymore bet the hall that she could get from London to Marbury between sunrise and sunset in a single day. Now, the Dun managed it, but when she reached the hall, she drank from the water trough before sadly dropping dead. Lord Barrymore buried her in the park and a stone marked the spot. And the inscription on the stone read, and I quote, "Here lies Marbury Dun, the fastest horse that ever run, clothed in a linen sheet, with silver shoes upon her feet," end quote. Now, an addendum to this story actually claims Lord Barrymore bought the mare as a wedding present for his wife, and he agreed to the day-long dash to ensure the mare would arrive in time for the wedding. Now, apparently Lady Barrymore was so upset about the loss of her mare that she actually died herself soon after, and she wanted to be buried where the mare died, but Lord Barrymore just completely ignored that and buried her in the churchyard anyway. And it seems that her ghost told him that she would ride her lovely mare forever rather than rest. And there's something quite touching about that, I think, that Lady Barrymore decides to just ignore her husband because he's ignored her wishes, and I thought that was something quite touching, that she wanted to continue to spend time with her mare, and it seems that they do, so that's sad but lovely at the same time. And in terms of spectral horses, while we might think of headless horsemen, which I think we've covered on the podcast, I've definitely done it on the blog, I can't remember now. I mean, I've been doing this long enough, it's quite easy to forget what I haven't covered. But we do also sometimes see headless horses in ghost stories too. Now, don't forget there was that weird thing when we looked at like the folklore of haunted carriages and spectral carriages and things like that, that sometimes smugglers would paint a horse's body, but not the head, so they would look like a spectral headless horse in order to start rumours about these spectral carriages pulled by spectral horses to try and get people to stay away from smuggling routes. But then there are actually some actual stories of headless horses, as ghosts I should say, and one of them is rather famous because it's Anne Boleyn herself, and she apparently rides down Blickling Park's Avenue in Norfolk once a year in a coach pulled by 4 headless black horses, and as befitting her fate, she carries her head in her lap. Now, so that story's a funny one because originally it was actually, I think, her father who had a link with Blickling Hall, and over time it's become Anne, probably because she's more famous and potentially more recognisable. But there we go. Another carriage, also pulled by headless horses, apparently arrives at Caister Castle in Norfolk once a year at midnight to collect, and I quote, unearthly passengers, end quote. It doesn't really say much more about that as to who these passengers are. That, to me, sounds an awful lot like the various tales that you get in folklore around the British Isles in general, actually. And these coaches are often death omens. Occasionally it's whoever sees them might die, or it just precedes a death in the family of the house who it calls at, and so on and so forth. So it's quite interesting that this one in Caister Castle in Norfolk is specifically pulled by headless horses. Because let's be honest, I mean, if you're going to be picking up the dead, you might as well go goth and do it in style. Now, our next legend actually has two variations, and the basic gist of this one is the idea of a horse that will be the death of you. So if you visit the church in Minster in Sheppey in Kent, you might actually spot a tomb featuring a horse's head emerging from the waves. And it seems that this particular monument referenced a key moment for its owner, Sir Robert de Shurland. Now, according to local legend, Sir Robert buried a priest alive, as one does, and needed a pardon from the king. Now, as luck would have it, the king was on a ship that was anchored just off Sheppey. So Sir Robert, rather than using a boat like any normal person would, made his horse swim 2 miles to the ship. And obviously, yes, horses can swim, but that is quite a distance. Now, the king pardoned him, probably because he'd actually made it that far, and then Sir Robert's horse had to carry him all the way back to land again. Once back on the land, someone expressed admiration for the horse's feat of endurance, but suggested, perhaps jokingly, that the horse had magic powers in order to achieve it. Horrified, Sir Robert cut off the horse's head, and a year later, when riding along the same beach, his new horse stumbled and Sir Robert fell off. He landed on the skull of his earlier horse and later died, and I think that's what you get for killing your loyal steed, really. Now, there is another version in which a hag prophesied that the horse that carried him to the ship would be the death of him, which explained why Sir Robert killed the horse once he got back onto the beach, hoping to avoid such a fate. However, fate often has quite an interesting sense of humour, so years later he encountered the same witch sitting on that same horse's skull on the beach. Now, Sir Robert kicked the skull in fury, and one of the teeth not only pierced his boot but also cut his foot, and he later died of gangrene in the wound. So again, I think he pretty much brought that one on himself. And this is something that you do see with prophecies quite often, that the person ends up fulfilling them because they're that desperate to take actions to avoid them that they end up making them come true. So they are very much self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think with the former one, the idea of killing the horse just because it might be magical. I mean, who wouldn't want to have a magical horse? You know what I mean? That is just a weird one. Now, I should point out that Jennifer Westwood and Jacqueline Simpson do note that the horse head and waves motif is probably more likely something from heraldry, and the legends have become attached to the myth because they explain its presence in much more imaginative ways than heraldry. But both versions do seem like a really horrendous way to treat an animal that's just saved your life. Now we're going to move on to hag riding, which is a very different form of riding horses than the previous story. And I have covered hag riding a few times on the podcast. And if you haven't heard those episodes, in short, if a person found their horse sweating and exhausted in the morning, then they might believe that witches or fairies had ridden the horse all night. And if you found knots in their mane, then that was even more of a sign of it, because they were believed to be created either for mischief or where the rider clung on, so therefore it was another sure sign that some hag riding had been going on. You could stop fairies or witches from actually taking your horse by hanging a hagstone in the stall above them, and that would apparently prevent that from happening. Yet witches could also transform young men into horses using their magic bridles, which was also a form of hag riding. So in this case, the horse that was ridden to exhaustion was actually a human who'd been transformed into horse form. And one young carter working on a farm in the Kennet Valley in Berkshire actually complained of being ridden to exhaustion by a witch that turned him into a horse every night. Eventually, he actually did tell one of the thatchers on the farm about his experiences, and the thatcher was obviously quite curious about this, and he offered to swap beds with him. So that night, the witch comes in, doesn't really pay attention to who's in the bed that she's throwing the bridle over, but she turns the thatcher into a horse. But then when they get to their destination, because the thatcher isn't absolutely knackered from all this running back and forward, he manages to get the bridle off. Back in human form, the thatcher then hid until the witch returned, at which point he then threw the bridle over her. She turned into a mare and he rode her home, and he actually had her reshod at a blacksmith's on the way back. And obviously there's the episodes about blacksmiths in folklore if you're interested in stuff to do with them. But you won't be surprised at all to learn that the farmer's wife was rather conspicuous by her absence the next day. And the workman then told the farmer what had happened, and he found his wife playing sick in bed, and when he pulled off the bedclothes he discovered a horseshoe nailed to her hand. It was quite clear that the farmer's wife was actually the witch in question. Now, a similar story actually appeared in Longstanton in Cambridgeshire, when in 1697 Margaret Pryor accused some Quakers of using a bridle to turn her into a mare, which seems a little bit far-fetched. But this accusation even reached the Cambridge Assizes, and Pryor claimed that they'd written her to a feast 4 miles away. Now, the judge asked why this had only happened the once, so Pryor explained that she'd broken their enchantment by burning some of her hair and some elder bark. Now, the presiding judge obviously had a little bit of sense, and he seized on that admission as Pryor's own use of sorcery to kind of counter the previous sorcery, and then dismissed the case as being a complete fantasy, which is quite an interesting one. So the Quakers were allowed to go free. But I think that these particular tales do tend to have quite a lot in common, that there's often this element of a human is turned into a horse with this magic bridle, which is interesting because we see similar ideas around bridles with Kelpies, although obviously that is in the Kelpie episode. But it does demonstrate this greater degree of control over the person by the witch, and the fact that they turn you into a horse means that you're at least useful to them. In this particular instance, obviously, Pryor's not blaming a witch, but rather Quakers for using witchcraft or sorcery, but there's not necessarily any sense that she was actually accusing them specifically of being witches, but just rather that they turned her into a horse, which, to be fair, would be a bit annoying. And in all of these stories as well, the person being turned into a horse always manages to escape somehow, either because they know how to use their own sorcery, as in Pryor's case, or they manage to enlist the aid of another person who somehow turns the table. So it's quite a common story motif, so it does make me wonder how much there was one central story that was then repeated around the country with just different local elements. But it is quite an interesting one nonetheless, and it does provide us with that alternative meaning of hag riding, that it wasn't just the idea that the witches might steal your own horse, they might turn you into one as well. And we do also find other elements to do with witches and horses through the idea of immovable horses. And to be fair, I mean, I love horses, I really do, but they can be quite skittish animals, and riders might find that they just suddenly refuse to go any further for no apparent reason. And if the rider can see no obvious cause, then they might think that the horse has actually sensed a ghost, or even a place where blood has been shed, according to the folklore. Now, elsewhere, witches or fairies might work magic to actually keep the horse from moving, so it's not even the horse's fault at this point. And we see this in the tales of Silky in Northumberland, and obviously there's a whole episode about Silky. But in these ones, the eponymous fairy would bewitch a horse so that they would go no further, and only touching the horse with a rowan branch would break the enchantment. Now, if it was actually witchcraft that was to blame, you could try attacking the witch herself, and a carter in Stone, Buckinghamshire, found his team of 4 refused to go any further once they reached a cluster of houses. Now, no matter what he did, the horses just absolutely positively refused to move. Eventually, the carter spotted an old woman watching from her gate, so he cracked his whip against her hand, which does seem a bit excessive, but the moment the blood flowed, the horses set off again because the enchantment had been broken. And you sometimes get this in various witch stories, that if you can draw blood from the witch, it will break whatever spell it is that she's cast, in this case, over horses. But there was one particularly strange experience that I came across, which happened near Bridgnorth in Shropshire in the mid-1800s, when a young woman and her friends were driving in a carriage when the horse just absolutely refused to go any further and just stopped. Now, no matter what the driver did, the horse just refused to move. So eventually, the young woman thought, I'll have a go, how hard can it be? And she tries coaxing the horse herself. But when she then grabbed hold of the bridle, an invisible force cast her backwards, actually knocking her against a fence. A huge hand and arm then suddenly appeared, holding the horse's neck, only disappearing when the nearby church clock struck midday. Now, while the horse could then move again, it was actually declared unfit for work and never worked again. But the young woman discovered that just before noon her estranged aunt had died in Paris, leading the folklorist Charlotte Byrne, who collected the story, to theorise that the aunt had not only been haunting her niece, but she'd also been a witch as well, and she'd even managed to bewitch the horse from going any further at the point that she died, even if she was in Paris at the time. which is quite an interesting one. So this one kind of blends ideas of the fetch, of the crisis apparition, and of the idea of being able to bewitch horses. So it's quite an interesting combination of various folkloric motifs. And I thought I'd put some nicer ones in, just because obviously it can get a little bit like, oh my god, those poor horses. And there are the legends of the mighty leaps, and there's 2 here, but there are various folk tales from different places, and one of them that we're going to have a look at is Shropshire, and is associated with the outlaw Wild Humphrey Kynaston. Now, in one of the stories, his horse leapt 12 metres across the River Severn, and in another, the horse cleared the 14.5 kilometres from Nestcliff Hill to Ellesmere, and also the 8 kilometres from the hill to Lowton Park. Now, the legends do suggest a somewhat demonic nature to the horse, which is then explained in being able to make these fantastical leaps, and obviously Kynaston's critics then accuse him of selling his soul to the devil. But I do like the fact that the horse just seems to be absolutely amazing at making these leaps that are just a ridiculous distance, because 14.5 kilometres is quite far. Elsewhere, however, there's one that actually sounds vaguely plausible, which is Bayard's Leap in Lincolnshire, and it's named for a fearsome leap by a horse named Bayard. And in this legend, a witch lived in the area and she made a habit of plaguing the farmers. Now, one of them got so fed up with their antics that he eventually went to a wise man for help. He advised him to turn his horses out of the farmyard and then send them to the pond. Next, the farmer needed to throw a stone into the pond and choose whichever horse looked up first for the next part of the task. That night, the farmer would use that horse to ride to the witch's cottage and ask her to accompany him for a ride. And it was vital that he carried a knife and kept it sticking outwards so that the witch would cut herself when she leapt onto the horse. And again, as we saw earlier with the carter and the whip, if you could draw blood from the witch, you would then break all of her enchantments and you would basically stop her shenanigans, essentially. Now, the farmer did as he was told, and he felt somewhat concerned that the first horse that looked up was Bayard, his blind horse. Still, he followed the advice and he went to the hut anyway, riding Bayard. And every time the witch tried to climb onto the horse and didn't cut her arm, Bayard leapt forwards 7 yards. The third time, she leapt onto Bayard's back, but she did actually cut her arm, so her power drained away as she bled and her reign of terror ended. But people would actually go to visit Bayard's hoofprints where he leaped 3 times. And I think leaping 7 yards is still quite far, but also seems a little bit more achievable than 14.5 kilometres. But I quite like that story, the fact that the blind horse ends up being the hero, which is quite cool. And I also thought that these 2 stories, while obviously they're quite short, because they turn the horses into heroes, after all the horrible things that have happened to horses in the previous story, I thought that it was quite nice to celebrate horses and so on. But speaking of horses as heroes, I simply had to include Black Bess. Now, you may or may not have heard of the midnight ride to York, supposedly undertaken by Dick Turpin, riding his faithful mare Black Bess. And indeed, in English folklore, Bess is probably one of the most famous horses. Now, Turpin was supposed to have made an overnight ride from London to York, which is about 320 kilometres, on his horse Black Bess. And so many people will repeat it as if it genuinely happened. But it is worth knowing that this story was actually made famous by the Victorian novelist William Harrison Ainsworth, and it was about 100 years after Turpin's death. So it is worth bearing in mind that that was actually nonsense. Now, there is one legend of a midnight ride which is supposed to have happened, and in this one, the highwayman in question robbed a man at 4 a.m. on Gad's Hill in Kent in 1676, and he rode all the way to York, changing horses along the way, and as soon as he arrived the same afternoon, he made for the nearest bowling green. As luck would have it, the Lord Mayor of York was also there, and the highwayman apparently contrived to ensure the mayor knew the exact time and date that he spoke to said highwayman by asking him a few questions while he placed a bet. When accused by the man he robbed, the highwayman then produced the Lord Mayor as an alibi because no one believed he could have carried out the robbery in Kent at 4 a.m. and then been in York the same day, and therefore he must be innocent. And the funny thing is, it is far more likely that William Nevison was the highwayman responsible for the midnight ride, and bearing in mind that was supposed to have happened in 1676. Turpin was only born in 1705, so he wasn't even alive when the robbery originally took place. And I think one of the things that's fascinating is the way that Dick Turpin and Black Bess have then become these almost legendary figures. But it is worth bearing in mind that Turpin was really, really an unpleasant person, and a lot of the romanticisation of him has come from this novel Rookwood, but in reality he started his career of crime early. He started with stealing cattle, then moved on to smuggling, went on to deer stealing, and then eventually housebreaking. And at one point there was actually a £50 reward offered for the arrest of any member of his gang. Once he went on to highway robbery, it's also worth noting that his faithful steed Black Bess was completely fictional, because she only appears in the 1860s penny dreadful by Edward Viles called Black Bess or the Night of the Road. And again, Turpin was the kind of man who would actually kill a horse in case someone could identify it. So you will see people, and indeed tourist locations, will confidently assert that Turpin did this midnight ride to York. Nope, entirely fictional. So that's another one of those things. Honestly, I didn't intend the Fabulous Folklore was just going to end up debunking things, but things like that really do wind me up when people insist that stuff is true when it's just not, because there's no need for it. But anyway, we are talking about horses. So I wanted to go on to two last topics, and the first one is horses and folk remedies, because weirdly, horses do appear in a couple of remedies. Now, the first one actually feels a little bit more achievable, although I don't actually think it works the way that they think it does, or indeed at all. And in this one, in late 19th century Gloucestershire, a woman claimed that she'd cured a wen on her neck by wearing a braid of a grey stallion's tail hair around her neck. So obviously, you can get hold of, hair from a stallion's tail, make it into a braid, and then wear it around your neck. In early 20th century Herefordshire, a woman explained that she had managed to get 9 hairs from a stallion's tail from someone else, which she then braided. It was very important not to pay for the hairs or indeed to say thank you. She wore the plait inside a bag around her neck until the bag fell apart, and apparently again this cured the problem. Horse hooves were considered particularly helpful to keep in the house, and in the 16th century an owner would keep his horse's hooves as a sacred item after the horse died. In the 18th century, midwives were directed to hold a horse's hoof near a pregnant woman's genitals if her waters broke but birth took too long to get underway. And from what I can gather from actually reading this book, because it is from 1782, it feels like just simply holding the horse's hoofs nearby would be enough to encourage the child to actually be born. And if you happen to find a horse's back tooth by accident while you were out and about, you should carry it with you for the rest of your life, and you would always have money, which is a good one to bear in mind. How you would recognise a horse's back tooth, I will leave that one up to you. But our final topic is horse skulls and house protection, which is one of the more unusual uses for horse bits. And horse bones are sometimes found bricked into walls and chimneys, usually leg bones and jaw bones, but at Toad Hall in Cheshire, an entire horse skeleton was actually found under the threshold. Now, the skull of a horse with 2 boar tusks inserted into its tooth sockets emerged in the wall of a rectory on the Isle of Man, and research showed the skull dated to the original building's construction. Now, this implies that the builders added it during construction rather than later. Now, Yvonne Hayhurst does note elsewhere the occasional use of putting a horse's skull under each of a house's 4 corners, but in this particular instance on the Isle of Man, because there was only one, there was a theory that perhaps the other 3 walls had been reconstructed and therefore that was why only one skull remained, but the one that was found in the north wall. And many link the direction of north with the arrival of evil, so adding a skull into that wall might have been for extra home protection. Now, I'm saying might because it's not always obvious why someone might use horse bones within the home. Others have been found in Sweden, Finland and Ireland, and the Swedish example does actually offer a little bit of explanation because there was a document that explained the horse skull in a fireplace was to guard against fire. Norfolk writer W.H. Barrett described seeing his uncle put a horse's head under the foundations for a Methodist chapel when he was 6 in 1897, and in this particular incident the builders poured the first glass from a bottle of beer over the head before covering it with bricks when they finished drinking the beer. Barrett's uncle explained that they'd followed this ritual to drive away evil. However, sometimes the explanation can be far more mundane, and owners at houses in Bedfordshire and Suffolk explained that they'd put horse skulls under the floor to improve the acoustics in that particular room, and that was also the case in some Scandinavian or Irish examples where the skull added resonance to churches. So it just goes to show that you can't always immediately assume something is there for protective purposes. They might be there for a reason that you honestly couldn't have guessed at if you hadn't asked. But what do we make of this horse folklore? Well, I think ultimately their general nervousness, because they are prey animals, does explain their vulnerability to witches and fairies. But I also think that they're quite vulnerable to witches and fairies purely because they're really useful to humans. Because a lot of animals are prey animals and witches and fairies don't necessarily target them. So I think the fact that they target horses is because of their proximity to people. Now, with the stories of humans being turned into horses, I think this is literally just a case of a witch turning a human into something that will be helpful, because what would be the point of turning a human into, I don't know, a bank vault? It would be really weird, where it'd be kind of funny, but it doesn't make much sense compared to a horse. Obviously, like I say, they're used in home protection, demonstrates again that close relationship, I think, between humans and horses, and the fact that they were used for protective purposes, while a horse isn't really a protective animal to start with, not compared to something like a guard dog or indeed a goose, as we explained in one of the geese episodes. But I think it's the fact that obviously a horse still has that importance within the family, which is why you would also keep the hooves as well. And I think it's quite interesting, really, that we look at these stories the way that we do, because when we look at Legends of Black Bess, she taps into that same legendary speed as the Marbury Dun that we looked at the start of the episode. But I think that ultimately we can see horses as being both helpers and companions that humans just don't always treat very well, which I do think is a crying shame, because horses are clearly quite intelligent and, they have been our companions for thousands of years now. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed the folklore of horses. I still haven't decided what I'm going to do for the final week yet, because I've actually got about 4 to choose from. So you'll get a nice surprise when you put the next one on, and there we go. But anyway, this episode has gone on a bit longer than I would have liked, so I will see you next week for our final episode in this theme. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.